A thread by Carlos Osuita. Referring to a video on YouTube, freeway foot race ends with leader of former Chop Zone being led away in handcuffs. This is exactly what happened all over the Middle East when trained professionals took on the ridiculous flop sweat factories masquerading as badasses. And it happened at the end of the fighting in Berlin. Lots and lots of crying and begging for mercy. I don't have what it takes to be a combat trooper or executioner, regardless of what the perpetrator has done. The best explanation comes from a police detective who spent years tracking down Ted Bundy and then interrogated him before Bundy's execution. Bundy kept telling the authorities that he'd confess to more murders if they just let him live a little longer. Finally, it was clear that he was stringing them along, so the detective left. He didn't stay to watch Bundy's execution. "I've seen enough death," he said. That's where I am. But I totally get those with the strength to take out the garbage. It's not that I feel sympathy for murderers and terrorists. It's just that I've been exposed to too much violent death. I've reached my fill. But I think it's funny when these bastards run like bunnies and then cry when caught. Just a day earlier, they were all big and tough, lording it over defenseless civilians. Here's what I always say. No matter how much of a badass you or think you are, someday you'll meet someone who's more of a badass. It's best to not tempt fate. I've written a lot about my father. He served in the Korean War. After he died, I had to find out who he really was, and the answer was absolutely beyond my comprehension. Unlike me, he had no problem doing things, anything. Most of it has to do with his upbringing. He was born in an era during which all young men expected that someday they would go to war. My father had living relatives who were veterans of the Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, and the Spanish-American War. His father was a combat infantryman in World War I. All of his uncles were combat veterans in World War II. My father was born in a part of the country where they killed most of their own food: deer, hogs, rabbits, squirrel. He grew up hunting. In the Korean War, he belonged to a unit that fought behind the front lines. Basically, he simply hunted again, but this time it was Chinese soldiers. The Chinese initially won battles by using human waves. Guess what happened? The UN troops simply upped their firepower. The Korean War was the first of the only two UN wars, the second being the Gulf War. In the Korean War, the Chinese human waves were wiped out by jet aircraft with 6 M3 machine guns. YouTube video, link in the description, check it out. 6 M3s is 120 50 caliber bullets per second. My father wasn't traumatized because he grew up killing. It was just a fact of life. I understand the need for people who can take out the garbage, and I think they're right to do what they do. I'm just saying that I saw too much of it early, and it wrecked me. There was never a chance that I could become a cop or join the armed forces. I would have hesitated and let down my squad. Today, I'm different, but I still would not want to kill anyone. Ted Bundy said about himself, "I'm the most cold-blooded son of a bitch you'll ever meet." No, he wasn't. He spent his last night crying, and he couldn't eat a bite of his last meal. He was afraid. I remember reading of a gangster who asked for a cigar in the gas chamber, so they gave him one and let him smoke it as the cyanide wafted up. Murderer George Apple said that as he was being strapped into the electric chair, "Well, gentlemen, you're about to see a baked apple." An outlaw being hanged in the Old West was asked if he had any last words. "I came here to get hanged, not to make speeches," he said. The Clutter family murders are the basis for Truman Capote's masterwork, In Cold Blood. Trailer in the description. Scott Wilson's portrayal of Richard Hickok was quite accurate. But the movie equates capital punishment with murder. So they made Hickok say things he never said. They got his execution right. Before he was hanged, he shook the hands of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents and said, "Nice to see you, no hard feelings, goodbye." Hickok supported capital punishment. He said he deserved what he got. Truman Capote fell in love with the hideous, remorseless Perry Smith, the ultimate bad boy. In the movie, Robert Blake plays him as a victim of society, forced to murder Herb, Bonnie Mae, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter. The two elder daughters, Beverly and Eviana, were staying somewhere else that night. The murderers tied them up, searched the house for $10,000 that didn't exist, and then killed the family with a shotgun one by one, starting in the basement. All they had to do was wear masks, but they wanted to murder. In the movie, Robert Blake apologizes before he's hanged, and they spend a lot of time showing how heartless it all is. In reality, Smith made a speech about how capital punishment was morally and legally wrong, and he refused to mount the scaffold. So they dragged him. I used to love the movie, but now I can't watch it. Equating capital punishment with murder is utterly immoral. It shows a total disregard for the victims. If the citizens voted in and the family agrees, that should be the end of it. You don't have to support capital punishment, but if you tell supporters of capital punishment that they're just as bad as the murderers, that makes you evil. How does capital punishment impact you anyway? Name the last 10 people executed in the US. You can't. It's just more posing. The issue has nothing whatsoever to do with me. I'm totally indifferent to it. There's another BS argument that if you support it, you should be forced to watch it. Please. Almost everyone who says that thinks that adult entertainment is fine. If you support adult entertainment, you should be forced to watch adult entertainment movies being made. Bring your vomit bucket and be prepared to check yourself into the local mental institution for emergency treatment. Life is very complicated. You can't reduce it to childish absolutes. At any rate, I laughed at this. Lots of Antifa and BLM are doing that right now. It's just not being caught on camera. Haven't you noticed Donald Trump's new steeliness? There's a phrase everyone needs to memorize: preparing the battlefield. The US and our Arab allies spent 9 months making a three-dimensional digital map of the city of Mosul. Remember the underground installations? YouTube video captured ISIS sniper tunnel. ISIS jackhammered out entire underground cities. Why didn't they work? Because somehow they were all mapped digitally. The insides and outsides of all structures were mapped, and all the troglodytes were killed. Fast, so fast that their little meals sat there undisturbed. The battlefield was thoroughly prepared. Trump spent 4 years preparing the battlefield. The reason he invoked the Stafford Act was that he knew that someone would try something during the pandemic and economic shutdown. Antifa, BLM, and foreign powers spent years preparing for the riots we saw, and it was all stopped in 3 nights. This is because Antifa, BLM, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the Russians are stupid. They still think of Trump as a blockhead. That's good. It means they'll always lose. Putin just got voted in until 2036. Russia is hopeless. China is hopeless. The Iranian mullahs are hopeless, and leftists are hopeless. There's no need to try and reach them. They needed to be thwarted and put out of our minds. The professionals are on the job, making stupid people cry all over the country. All is well.